Having done a Seiko design history video on traditional cases, I thought it'd be time to do one on the Tuna can. Now, the Tuna can's been around for a while, and initially I thought I would do this video by chronological order, going through the timeline from 75 onwards. But then I realized it gets a little bit messy, so I thought it might be easier to break things down in terms of functionality. And for the first and most essential category, I'll start with the automatic tuna can. Automatic tuna can is important because it was the very first tuna can ever released, and in the eyes of some purists is the only real tuna can. This is the 6159-022. The 6159 is a reference to the movement. It was a high beat Grand Seiko movement. But for the purposes of this design history video, that's not so important. When you look at this watch, the things that make it stand out as a iconic tuna can are the shroud, the 4 o'clock large crown, the unique handset, and when we eventually get to it, the one-piece case back. Let's start with the shroud. Now, again, this came out in 1975. You have to understand that back in 1975, if you were doing air diving, scuba diving, that bezel was really, really important. If you were going to time your decompression stops, or if you're going to time how much oxygen you have, you would set your bezel as needed. As you're swimming, as you're maneuvering, if you accidentally hit your bezel against something and dislodge it, in an absolute worst case scenario, that could be the difference between life and death. Now, different companies tried to minimize that. Now, the most standard, basic way is the one-directional bezel, which has basically been around since dive watches. You could only twist it counterclockwise. It won't go clockwise. Other companies try to take it a step further, like Omega with their Ploprof had a hump on the side with a red button. For you to be able to rotate the bezel, you had to depress the button. While it seemed like a good idea, the fact that only Squally copied it with their Tiger tells you that it was probably too much work and complication for relatively little gain. So that never really went anywhere. I think probably the most elegant iteration of a safety bezel on top of the one-way was Rolex's, I believe it was Rolex's design of a push bezel, where for the bezel to rotate, you had to push down to rotate it. But this watch, or more specifically this watch, was meant for saturation diving, which is a much more rigorous and extreme environment than something a scuba diver would experience. And the thought was that you needed even more protection. And that's where the shroud came in. As you can see, the shroud has an opening here, closure here, opening here, closure here. And the idea is, if you want to rotate your bezel, you put your fingers on the opening and rotate. But you can't do that on this side. And the idea is, if you bump your watch into something, these raised areas on the shroud would decrease the likelihood of you dislodging the bezel. That is the history, that is the point behind it. And that is obviously one of the most iconic elements of the tuna can, and it's universal. The crown at 4 o'clock is also usually a pretty essential component for a traditional tuna can. I'll discuss at least one other watch that doesn't have that, and you can debate amongst yourselves if it really should be categorized as a tuna can, but I think it does deserve mention. The next we have are the hands. The handset is very unique to the tuna can. In particular, there's a bisection in the hour and minute hand. I don't know for sure what the purpose of it is, aside to say that it's only specific to automatic tuna cans, originally in the 6159, presumably just as a nod to the heritage in the 2009-2010 SBDX011. The only other reference I have for something like this is in the old Zodiac Seawolves. The original Zodiac Seawolf hands, the triangle wedges, they didn't have a little skeleton running down the middle, and those watches had a problem with the radium and possibly later even the tritium, but mostly the radium paint cracking and collapsing. So eventually Zodiac decided to put a little skeleton similar to this on the Seawolves, and that apparently helped maintain the integrity of the luminous paint. So I'm guessing it's a possibility that that's why you have this bisection as well. Though, as we'll later see, not all other tunas have that. And the last component that's essential is the one-piece case. Automatic tuna cans all have one-piece cases. You see, traditionally you'd have notches in a case back that could be unscrewed, whereas this doesn't, because this is all one piece. The point of it is to have one less area of water exposure. But the downside of it is servicing. If you want to service this watch, you have to unscrew the shroud. In this case, it has hex. In the original one, easy to use Phillips screws, but you undo it. Then you undo the bezel. Then you unscrew the crystal, and then you pop everything out this way, and then you service, maintain, or whatever else you need to do. So the downside is it's a little bit more complicated servicing wise, but the upside is, again, it's one less source of water exposure. Because if you have a traditional case and you're changing a battery or servicing it, and then you don't grease up the gasket well, it gets pinched or something like that, that's a possible source of water ingress. So that's what we have with the automatic Tuna. Again, the original 6159 came out about 1975. The next step in its evolution was its historical reissue, which came out in around 2000. That looked very similar to this, except the movement was downgraded to an 8L35 in relative terms. And this SBDX011 came out in about 2009. The main difference between this and this, aside from the coloring and the movement, is the size. This is a few millimeters longer and a few millimeters taller. So in that respect, this is a little bit easier to wear than the larger 011. The one advantage you have of it being longer is the strap sits a lot easier in this one, because it's longer here. The strap can sit flat like this, whereas the shorter, stubbier 6159, the strap can't really go all the way flat, and it tends to sit sort of like this. So especially when you're using a rubber or polyurethane strap that's a bit more rigid than this textile strap, it may affect the degree of comfort you have. In the next part of the video, I'll discuss the other categories.